Chapter 1. The cold shape with a world without walls or eyes, your eyes for a moment, and imagine the world as it was 50,000 years ago. There are no roads. There are no roads. There are no walls of brick or standing between you and the night. The sky above is a vast, unbroken darkness, blazing with more stars than most of us have ever seen in our lives. There is not a single electric light anywhere on Earth to dim them, and it is cold. It is a cold that we, living in, who knows, ours windows, the rooms, have lost the ability to imagine. It is the cold of a Pleistocene winter on the open, of Iberia or Central Europe or the plains of North America. Temperatures that drop to -30, -40, -50 degrees Celsius on the worst nights, where exposed skin freezes in minutes, and where a human being who lies down in the snow without protection will not wake up. And yet humans were there. Our ancestors, and before them Homo erectus and Homo and the Neanderthals, survived these famous, not once but generation after generation, hundreds of thousands of years, in environments that should by any physical reasoning have killed them. They had no wool coats manufactured in factories. They had no chemical hand warmers or synthetic sleeping bags rated for extreme temperatures. They had what they could hunt, what could gather, what they could behold from the materials the landscape provided, and what they could learn from their parents, from their own hard experience, from the accumulated wisdom of generations, about how to keep a body warm through the long dark nights of a world ice. This is the story of how they did it. It is a story written not in books, it's in bone, but in sharpness of ancient hearths, in the wear patterns on stone tools and the preserved in the presentations at music mass enough in the abandoned shelters. Long shelters. It is a story that archaeologists and paleoanthropologists have been piecing together for more than a century, and incomplete. And it is still incomplete. But what we know is extraordinary, and we can reasonably infer is extraordinary still. The ingenuity, the adaptability, and sheer physical toughness of our earliest ancestors facing the cold of the Pleistocene winter with nothing but their intelligence and their cooperation is one of the most remarkable stories of life on Earth. The Ice Age world, setting the stage, understand how early humans through winter nights. We need to understand the world in which they were sleeping. The Pleistocene epoch, the geological era that stretched from approximately 2.26 million years ago to about 11,700 years ago, was characterized by repeated cycles of glaciation, periods in which massive sheets of ice expanded from the poles, and the poles amount is cover enormous areas of what are now temperate and subtropical regions. During the peak of the last glacial maximum, ice sheets covered most of northern Europe, all of Scandinavia, much of North America, down to the latitude of present-day New York and Chicago, and vast areas of Siberia and Central Asia. The climate during these glacial maximum was not merely cold in the places direct covered by ice. The entire global climate system was disrupted. Even areas far of the ice sheets experienced winters more severe than those of the same latitudes. Today, the Great Mammoth Steppe, the vast grassland ecosystem that stretched from Western Europe across Siberia to North America, was a cold, dry, wind-scoured, drier environment where winter temperatures regularly reached levels that would be considered extreme in the coldest inhabited regions of the modern world. And it was on this mammoth steppe, in the face of these conditions, that some of the most sophisticated human survival strategies in prehistoric history were developed. Who lived Mammoth Steppe were not primitive brutes shambling through a hostile world in helpless ignorance. They were Homo sapiens, modern humans with the same capacities we possess today, or in earlier periods, Neanderthals, whose cognitive capabilities, while different from ours, were clearly sufficient to sustain survival in the most demanding environments on Earth for hundreds of thousands of years. These people carefully about the challenges they planned ahead. They accumulated knowledge across generations, and when it came to the problem of surviving a winter night in a world without walls, they developed solutions of sophistication that we sufficient now through the patient work archaeology. Appreciate ut dirter tuo fire. The first and greatest technology that controlled and the transformation of the night. Before we can talk about sleeping in winter, we have to talk about fire. Fire Fire is the technology that made winter survivable. Our ancestors. And it is worth pausing to appreciate just how extraordinary that humans learned to control it. Is unpredictable and destructive. The vast majority of animals flee from it instinctively. And for good reason. Uncontrolled fires is one of the myths of forces in nature. The fact that our ancestors learned to manage it, to carry it, to feed it and direct it and use it as a tool. Since a sick augmented food in the history of our lineage, the oldest, unambiguous use of fire by members of the genius Homo comes from the site of Fire Cave in South Africa, where burned bone and plant ash deposits have been dated 1 million years ago by about 400,000 years ago. Well, that's very regular fires becomes widespread across the archaeological record of the Old World. At sites in Israel, in Europe, and as much of Africa. By the time modern homos appeared, approximately 100,000 years ago, the ability to make and maintain fire was almost certainly a universal feature of a human analogy, as fundamental to our way of lives as the modern stone tools. What did controlled fire mean for winter? Obvious answer is warmth. It produces radiant heat that can maintain the temperature of the immediate environment at survivable levels, even when the outside air is far below freezing. But fire's contribution to winter survival went far beyond simple heating. Fire allowed early humans to cook food, which increases the caloric availability of many foods and kills pathogens that could cause illness in a winter-stressed population. Fire provided light, extending the usable hours of the day beyond the brief winter daylight. Fire kept bay, allowing humans to sleep with somewhat greater security, and fire served as the social and psychological center of the group. The gathering point around which the knowledge, the stories, and the emotional bonds that held the community together were maintained through the long darkness of the winter night. How to make fire without matches. That makes me from the and the million different things able to it. There's a Pleistocene humans required knowledge, materials, and practice that were by means trivially acquired. The two primary methods of fire making available before the invention of metal tools were percussioner, fire starting, striking flint or pyrite iron-rich minerals to produce sparks, and friction fire starting, in which a hardwood spindle is rotated rapidly against a softer wood hearthboard to produce a hot coal through friction. Friction fire starting by the bow drill method in which a bow to rotate the spindle rapidly can produce coal in experienced hands in 30 to 6 seconds under good conditions. Under bad conditions, wet wood, cold, numbed fingers, wind, and it can take much longer or fail entirely. The identification of work well together, fire sun. The selection and preparation of tinder materials catch and hold a spark. The management of the coal from initial ignition sustain. These are sustained flame. These are skills that take months or years to develop, and that represent a significant body of knowledge. Archaeological evidence suggests that Pleistocene were sophisticated fire managers who thought care fuel supplies. At the site of Hollow 2 in Israel, approximately 23,000 years ago, excavators found the well-preserved remains of brush huts associated with hearths, along with large quantities of charred plant material that suggests that the inhabitants were actively managing the fuel for their fires rather than simply burning whatever was at hand. At multiple Upper Paleolithic sites in Europe, archaeologists have evidence that early humans were burning bone as a fuel source in environments where wood was scarce. An indication both the scarcity of conventional fuel in glacial environments and the resourcefulness with which early humans addressed that scarcity. Fire inside the shelter. The critical innovation. The full power of fire for winter survival was realized only when it was brought beside the shelter. A step was not as straightforward as it might seem. A fire inside an enclosed space produces smoke, and smoke in an enclosed space is deadly. The solution was the development of shelters with ventilation features. Openings that allowed smoke to escape while retaining it produced by the fire. This is a problem of fluid dynamics early humans solved empirically through trial error over generations of experimentation. The positioning of the fire, the height and placement of the smoke hole, the materials used in the shelter's construction, All of these factors influenced efficiencies, the smoke management, and getting them right was the difference between a warm, habitable shelter and a smoke-filled build. Death trap at the extraordinary site of Mezhirich in Ukraine. Dane, approximately 1,000 years. Archaeologists excavated four structures built entirely from mammoth bones. Massive constructions using the skulls, leg bones, and tusks of dozens of woolly mammoths as structural elements. Each of these structures contained a central hearth, and the positioning of the hearth relative to the structures and the lively flows looping the smoke out the deliberate deliberate design choice aimed at maximizing heat retention smoke effectively. These were not accidental arrangements. They were both out fire in foes. Spaces interact. Chapter 3. The shelter? Building against Belina, the cold architecture, before civilization, the image of early humans. If India's huips in caves is deeply cultured in popular culture, and it is not entirely wrong, caves do appear in the archaeological record as sites of human habitation, particularly in Western Europe during the Upper Paleolithic. But the dwelling image is profoundly misleading of how most early humans, most of the time, caves are relatively rare geological features, and the areas where Pleistocene humans were most numerous. The open mammoth steppe, the river valleys of Central Asia, the grasslands of Africa had few or no caves. The vast majority of the was in stringed shelters by human hands from the materials available in their environment. The oldest, generally accepted evidence for deliberated half a million years ago at in Japan, appears suggests the existence of wooden structures, but it is in the Upper Paleolithic period, roughly 50,000 to 10,000 years ago. The archaeological record of constructed shelters becomes rich enough to allow us to make detailed inferences about what they looked like and how they functioned. This period corresponds to the spread of anatomic modern Homo sapiens across Eurasia and Polynesia, and the development of the sophisticated tool technology and symbolic cultures that characterize the Upper Paleolithic. And it is the period in which the challenge of surviving the cold of glacial Europe drove the development of sophisticated prehistoric technology. The mammoth bone structures of the Eastern European plain, the most prehistoric Wirschland ever found, are the mammoth bone structures of the Eastern European plain. A series of sites from Ukraine and Russia that preserve the remains of substantial constructed dwellings, built almost entirely from the bones of woolly mammoths. The best preserved of these sites is Mezhirich in Ukraine, where settlers were forcibly excavating in the 1960s. But similar structures have been found at Mezin, Dobrnikivka, Gonsi, and Sansi, and several sites in the same region. Together, they represent coherent tradition, persistent in a dozen years of the last glacial maximum, when the climate of the Eastern European plain most severe. The construction of a mammoth bone dwelling was a formidable engineering undertaking. The largest of the Mezhirich structures measured 5 meters in diameter and required the bones of at least 95 individual mammoths, including skulls weighing up to 100 kilograms each. The structures appear to have been built with the deliberate logic. Larger, heavier bones at the base brought stability. The blood structured bones affected a blocking arrangement that created it. Roughly dome-shaped framework. The framework would then have been covered with mammoth hides. Probably multiple layers of them, creating an insulated outer shell that could withstand the wind and retain the heat generated by the central hearth. The thermal properties of such a structure would have been impressive. A well-built mammoth bone and hide dwelling, with a contained fire at its center, could maintain interior temperatures many tens warmer than the outside air. Researchers who have attempted experimental reconstructions of similar structures have found that a smaller hands only move at left sorry with the only hurter if bond of a tightly built, covered dwelling to comfortable levels in of extreme cold. The key insulating quality of the hide covering. Particularly when multiple layers are used, have insulating value comparable to pumping performance insulation materials. Tent structures of the Arctic. The living tradition to unding in more detail, hunters in the Holocene may have constructed and used portable winter shelters. It is enormously instructive to look at the indigenous peoples of the Arctic and subarctic regions who, until very recently, maintained traditional lifeways that included the construction and use of heights in conditions of extreme cold. The Siberian Nenets, the Evenets, the Eveni, the Evenki, the indigenous peoples of the Canadian Arctic. These communities developed over thousands years traditions of construction and cold weather sleeping represent the accumulated practical wisdom of generations of winter survival. The traditional tent forms of Arctic of the sets and lead and the yurt of the steppe peoples further south share certain fundamental principles that are directly relevant to understanding plunder. Pleistocene winter shelters, both conical or dome-shaped structure, supported by a block of poles and by multiple layers of animal hide. The conical form is particularly effective for winter use because it sheds snow efficiently, offers minimal surface area to the wind, and heat lets the center and the fire in the area are located. The double layer construction, an inner layer of hide with the fur turned inward for maximum insulation, and an outer layer with the fur turned outward for weatherproofing. Create a dead air space between the two layers that dramatically enhances the thermal of insulation of the structure. The Nenets chum, which is still in use today by deer herding communities in the Yamal Peninsula of northwestern Siberia, is dwarfed by the techno-rectan kind of portable hide tent that is almost used. The chum consists of 40 to 50 a conical framework covered by the 13 flint individual hides sewn together into large panels. A skilled Nenets family can erect or dantle a chum in about an hour. Portable shelter for people need to follow their reindeer deer herds across the Oslipen tundra. Experiments conducted inside traditional chums in conditions of extreme cold have found that a single small fire at the center maintain interior temperatures of 15 to 20 degrees Celsius, even when the outside temperature is -40. Far clothing and bedding. But the board foretells the invention that saved the human species. The human species that made midwinter survival possible for our ancestors. The ancestors' clothing is the technology that made it mobile that freed early humans from the necessity of staying close to a fixed shelter and allowed them to move landscape in pursuit of game and resources. The invention of effective cold weather clothing has mystery. And the evidence suggests that it happened remarkably early. Perhaps early 100,000 and 70,000 years ago, based on the genetic analysis of clothing lice, which diverged from head lice at approximately. Humans began wearing clothes regularly enough to create a new ecological niche for less adapted to living in fabric. Hair. Stone tools cannot tell the clothing that early humans made, because organic materials like hide and synthetic almost never survive in the archaeological record. But we can infer a great deal about clothing technology from the toology used to make it. Scrapers, stone tools is used to remove fat and membrane from the inner surface. A process known as fleshing are among the most ubiquitous tools in the archaeological record of the Paleolithic. Awls and needles, pointed, used to punch holes in hide and draw thread through them, appear in the record from at least 50,000 years ago and become in sophisticated Taiide. The Upper Paleolithic, the eyed needle, a needle with a small hole through which thread can be passed, appears in the archaeological record approximately 45,000 years ago and represents a technological capability that makes the construction of fitted tailored garments possible. The significance of the eyed needle cannot be overstated. Without it, clothing can be made by wrapping hides around the curium with straps, highs, or ties, functional, but limited in its ability to form a close fit that retains body heat effectively. With an eyed needle and some sinew thread, clothing can be tailored to fit the body precisely, with seams that close the gaps through which heat would otherwise escape. The difference in thermal performance between a wrapped hide and a tailored, fitted garment is substantial. Perhaps difference between in the most extreme conditions, the communities of the Upper Paleolithic who developed this technology had a significant survival advantage. Who had not were Pleistocene clothes actually like the best evidence for what Pleistocene cold weather clothing actually looked like comes from a combination of archaeological finds the analysis of use wear patterns, tools, and mostly remarkably, the preservation of actual organic remains at a small number of extraordinary sites. The frozen tombs of the Siberian permafrost have preserved organic materials of yes, 1,000 years ago that give us a vivid picture of the clothing traditions called adapted people and woven Buddhist materials. Both it's the scene they represented with roots. The Otzi Iceman, whose frozen body was discovered in the Alps in 1991 and dates to approximately 1,300 years ago, provides a particularly detailed picture of a detailed colder clothing technology. Though he too postdates the period we are primarily discussing, Otzi's clothing, a coat, alternating strips, and dark brown deer hide and goat hide, sewn together in a pattern that appears to have been deliberately designed for both warmth and flexibility. He wore leggings of goat hide, a loincloth of grass, shoes construct from bearskin soles and deer hide, stuffed with grass for insulation, and a bearskin cap. The shoes are particularly instructive. The waterproof outer sole and an insulated inner layer. A sophisticated understanding of the thermal and mechanical requirements of footwear in cold and wet conditions. Experimental reconstructions of these modern winter boots to modern wind boots, extrapolating from the evidence of Otzi. The and from the study of traditional clothing traditions, can we some reasonable reason like what they looked like. It was almost certainly multi-layered. An inner layer of furred hide worn with the fur against skin, as the fur's irregular fibers trap air most effectively when held close to the warm body, and an outer layer worn with the fur outward for weatherproofing and wind resistance. It was almost certainly tailored and fitted, at least in the using a sinew thread that a Paleolithic record, and it was almost certainly made from the hides of the large herbivores, reindeer, the bison, that were primary prey animals of Pleistocene hunters, and that provided both the most abundant and quality hide materials available. Bedding, of the night clothing protects the boxes during active hours of the day. Body then presents a different thermal challenge. When we sleep, our metabolic rate drops. Our core body temperature falls slightly, and our muscles, which generate significant heat during activity, are relaxed and generating much thermal energy. A sleeping person environment heat much faster than an active person. And the body loses particularly rapidly because ground conduction is one of the most efficient mechanisms of heat transfer from the human body. The oldest direct evidence for prehistoric bedding comes from Border Cave in South Africa. There's a plant material, primarily the leaves and stems of sedge grasses that appear to have been deliberately collected elms sources dated to approximately 200,000 years ago. This is a remarkable finding. It suggests that the practice of preparing a sleeping surface rather than simply lying directly out on the ground is an extraordinarily ancient behavior, predating the emergence of anatomically modern Homo sapiens. The grass layers at Border Cave appear to have been periodically refreshed with new material and to have aromatic plants, possibly including a plant with insect repellent properties, suggesting a level of deliberate management of the sleeping environment that goes well beyond simple. For winter, sleeping in cold environments, grass and leaf wooded supplements old hides by animal hides. Hide bedding serves multiple thermal simultaneously. It provides a barrier, the sleeper's bodied ground, preventing conductive heat loss. It provides an insulating layer above the sleeper's body, reducing radiant and convective heat loss. And when multiple hides are used, the layers trap air between them significantly enhances of the whole system. The principle is identical to that of a modern sleeping bag, which works by trapping air in the spaces and fibers and preventing them circulating and carrying from the body away from the body. The sleeping arrangement of a group sheltering together in a cold weather tent would have maximized both the use and shared body heat. Multiple individuals sleeping close together, ideally, with the smallest between bodies, create a shared thermal environment in which each person sends body heat to the others, warming the others. The collective body heat of a group of adults sleeping klantang can raise the temperature of the sleeping space ice degrees or degrees of what any individual could maintain alone. This is one of the reasons why sleeping in groups rather than individually. You have been viewers and as it still is among the indigenous communities of cold regions today. Chapter 5, the architecture of sleep. Inside the winter camp, organizing the sleeping space, the insias of a Pleistocene winter shelter was a carefully organized space. In every element of the arrangement was determined by the practical requirements of warmth, safety, and social order. The fire occupied the center of the structure, or sometimes slightly off-center, positioned to allow heat to circulate most effectively. And the sleeping areas were arranged around it in a ring close enough to benefit from the fire's warmth, but avoid the risk of rolling into it. Between the sleeping bodies, outer walls, the shelter of insulation. Additional insulation was typically provided by fur layers of hide, by stored equipment and food, or by the bodies of domesticated or semi-domesticated dogs, which appear in the archaeological record of Upper Paleolithic camps, and which would have provided both and a degree of security against predators. The spatial organization of sleeping areas within prehistoric shelters is something that can sometimes, from the distribution of and organic remains on site floors. At the site of Ohalo II in Israel, the preserved floor surface of Brus show concentrations of food remains, flint chips, other debris that suggest specific activity areas. Sleeping, food preparation, making were maintained in distinct zones within the shelter. At several the distribution of hearths and the arrangements is at larger shows by multiple family groups, each occupying a defined zone of the shared structure. The night watch, the night watch, link predators, is contemplates a matter of keeping warm. It was also a matter of staying alive in a world that contained a formidable array of large predators. Cave lions, hyenas, cave hyenas, cave bears, wolves, and other carnivores that would have regarded a sleeping group of humans as a potential food source. The maintenance of fire through the night, not only a thermal function, but also a critical security function. Large predators are generally unwilling to approach fire, air, and the light and smell of a fire have deterred most predator from approaching the shelter, whether early humans maintained a deliberate knot, keeping one or more individuals awake through the night to tend the fire and watch for threats, is something we cannot determine from the archaeological record, but ethnographic evidence from hunter-gatherer communities and of the situation suggests some form of scheduling that maintained fire tending through the night was likely. Among the Kungsan of the Kalahari, who have been being studied by anthropologists, the typical sleep pattern involves multiple periods of sleep, separated by periods of wakefulness, with fire tending, conversation, and social interaction occurring during the waking intervals. This pattern of polyphasic sleep, it's sleep per night rather than a single consolidated block, may be the Swan's human sleep pattern, and it would have been ideally to the dual requirements in air maintenance and predator vigilance. The anthropologist Jerome Siegel and his colleagues conducted a remarkable study published in 2015 in the Chief Woodrush. It managed the sleep patterns of individuals in three different hunter-gatherer societies: the Hadza of Tanzania, the San of Namibia, and the Namibia, and the Tsimane of Bolivia, none of whom had adopted sleep habits. They found none of these groups slept in a solidated reality and recommend. Instead, they multiple times the night. Total sleep time of between 5.7 and 1.1 hours per night. Individual variation. Crucially, they found that within each group, individuals' sleep wake periods were offset from each other. When some group members were asleep, others were awake. A pattern that would naturally result in continuous monitoring of the sleeping group by at least some of its members throughout the night. Temperature regulation during sleep, the human body. During sophisticated mechanisms for maintenance during sleep. And understanding these mechanisms helps us appreciate both the challenges and the adaptive strategies of winter sleeping environments. During sleep, the body's thermoregulatory was but operates at a reduced set. The body allows its core temperature to drop about 1 degree Celsius from the waking baseline as part of the normal sleep cycle. This slight drop in core temperature is actually for sleep initiation. The hands and feet warm as blood flow to the periphery increases, releasing heat. And this peripheral warming is one of the physiological signals promotes the onset of sleep. In a cold environment, this thermoregulatory system is under greater stress. The body must work harder to maintain its core temperature when the temperature is low. And this increased thermoregulatory effort is replaced by food. In a winter environment where food is scarce, the caloric cost of thermoregulation is not trivial. It presents a real metabolic burden that must be addressed through adequate nutrition. This is part of why the autumn hunting and food storage activities of Pleistocene hunter-gatherers were so critical. The caloric reserves that needed to be accumulated before winter were required not just for daytime activity, but for the continuous metabolic work, staying warm through the long, cold nights. Behavioral responses to cold during sleep are also well documented in both humans and other mammals. Drawing the knees toward the chest and wrapping the arms around the body reads the surface if exposes called near the core, nestling against another warm, exploits shared thermal environment, creating that sleeping in close contact, pulling bedding material tightly around the body and head, particularly around the head, which responsible to that heat loss. From the most vulnerable areas, all of these behaviors, instinctive responses to the early humans would have employed without needing to be taught them. Elsa, der 6, food, fat, and the fuel of winter, the caloric imperative discussion of how early humans survived winter nights is complete without addressing the question of food. Warmth is not just a matter of insulation and fire. A matter of metabolic energy comes from food. A human body shivering in the cold, burning calories at a dramatically increased rate. maintaining its core in a cold environment without shivering is burning calories more efficient, but at a higher rate than in a warm environment. The basic physics of thermodynamics dictate keeping out a warm body in a cold environment requires a continuous input energy, and that energy come from food. The most thermally valuable foods for cold weather survival are those with the dense and among all nutrients. Fat provides more than twice the calories per gram as protein or carbohydrate. The diets of cold-adapted hunter-gatherers both politically are characteristically high in fat from animal sources, and fat is the fuel of winter. The fatty, calorie-dense cuts of large herbivores, the bone marrow, that's the fat, the subcutaneous accumulate at autumn as animals prepare for their own winter, were the most prized food resources of Pleistocene hunters, and the evidence for deliberate marrow extraction from bones is one of the most consistent features of Paleolithic archaeological sites across the decades. World. Bone marrow is an extraordinarily calorie-dense food. The bone marrow provides approximately 7,000 to 8,000 calories, mostly from fat, with a high proportion of monounsaturated fatty acids that are associated with efficient metabolic utilization. The cracking of large mammal long bones to extract the marrow is a behavior that appears in the archaeological record as early as 1.8 million years ago at Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, and it remains one of the most consistent in the documented activities at Paleolithic sites across the entire span of human prehistory. The prevalence of this activity in the record suggests it was critically important food resource. But a nutritional necessity, particularly in winter, when other high-fat foods were scarce. Food storage preparedness, one of the most significant behavioral adaptations for winter survival, was the development of food storage. The development of food resources accumulated during lean winter months. The lean winter months. Food storage is a cognitively demanding behavior. Requires the ability to plan ahead, to delay an HUVF benefit, and to maintain and protect stored resources against spoilage and theft by other animals. The earliest first clear evidence for deliberate food storage in the human record dates to approximately 400,000 years ago. But it becomes much more prominent and it is particularly associated adaptations. In cold climates, the environment itself provides a natural food storage system. Low temperatures inhibit the bacterial and fungal decomposition that spoils food in warm conditions, and carcass left in the open in a winter for months. Pleistocene hunters unexplainably exploitative of their environment, deliberately killing large animals in autumn when fat reserves were at their highest, and caching portions of the carcass in cold locations for use through the winter. At the Clovis era sites of North America and the Upper Paleolithic sites of Siberia, there is evidence of exactly this kind of species. Bones and other food remains concentrated in natural cold storage features. Frozen ground pockets, snow-covered hollows, river banks, in ways that suggest deliberate preservation than simple consumption at the kill site, drying and smoking and smoldering afterward. So you later, though the record has insectics, so these sneaks are really proposed. Geologically, ethnographic analogy with historically documented hunter-gatherer groups suggests that dronkings were important components of the autumn food preparation to activities that preceded winter. The production of pemmican and mixture of dried meat and rendered fat that is among the most calorie-dense portable foods ever developed. Appears to have been practiced by Paleolithic peoples in North America, and may have been independent in other cold climate regions. Chapter 7, Neanderthal and the cold and the goof. A different approach are cold-adapted cousins before Homo sapiens spread across Eurasia. Another species of genus Homo already been surviving the cold of European, Asian winters for hundreds of thousands of years. The Neanderthals, Homo neanderthalensis, are our closest evolutionary relatives, sharing a common ancestor with modern humans approximately 600,000 to 800,000 years ago, and they occupied Europe and Western Asia from approximately 4,000 years ago until their extinction around 40,000 years ago. During this extraordinary span of time, Neanderthals survived multiple glacial periods, including episodes of cold even more severe than the last glacial maximum. Understanding how they did so tells us something important about the range of strategies available to cold-adapt hominins. Neanderthals had significant anatomical cold humans lack. Their bodies were shorter and stockier than those of modern humans, with developed bodies that body form that, in accordance with Bergmann's rule, reduces the surface-to-volume ratio and therefore heat loss. Their noses were large and differently shaped from those of modern humans, hence with it to have pinget up of an air and humidifying cold, dry air before it reached the lungs. A critical function in environments where breathing very, very dry air can damage the respirator. Their muscle mass is enormous, by the standards of modern humans, and metabolic heat generated by their larger muscles contributed significantly to their thermoregulation. Neanderthals used fire. There is clear archaeological evidence for fire use. Multiple Neanderthal sites across Europe and the Middle East, and they made and used stone tools of considerable sophistication, including the Musterian in the scene with Neanderthal. They constructed shelters, hunted large game great effectiveness, and appear to have cared for injured and elderly group members in ways the degree of social aid and mutual aid broadly comparable to what we see in early modern human communities. The question of whether Neanderthals made clothing incomparable in complexity to what early modern humans made is more contested. Recent evidence suggests they were at minimum using animal hides for basic covering, and may have been capable of more sophisticated garment construction. What Neanderthal sites? Winter sleeps developed several Neanderthal sites. And habitation arrangements give us glimpses of how these ancient cold-adapted hominins during winter, at the site of Abric Romani in Spain, a rock shelter occupied by Neanderthals approximately 50,000 years ago. Excavators found evidence of multiple hearths distributed across the shelter floor in a pattern that suggests different activity areas, including what appear to be spined by concentrations of small bones and other characteristic areas in a reclined position. At Kibara Cave in Israel, one of the excavated Neanderthal sites. The Bustra Vitas, the cave floor. Across the cave floor shows a hearth in the center of the habitation area and sleeping areas arranged around it. A spatial organization essentially identical to what we see at early modern human sites. The Kibara Neanderthals also buried their dead and perhaps that goes beyond mere utilitarian shelter use. The burial of a Neanderthal individual, possibly an adult male, in a deliberate grave at Kibara, with the abundant in a manner that appears to have been intentional, is one of the most debated pieces of evidence for Neanderthal symbolic or ritual behavior, and it speaks to the depth of the social psychological life that was lived in these ancient winter shelters. Chapter 8. The social life of the Wingnap camp. When the night was long, community in the dark the night in the winter in a Pleistocene camp was not simply of unconsciousness to be endured. It was a social space of great importance. A time released from the demands of activity. The group gathered around the fire and engaged in activities that built and maintained the social bonds on which collective survival depended. Language, storytelling, music, dance, practical skills, the negotiation of social relationships, the maintenance of alliance with other groups. All of these activities were conducted primarily in the social space of the evening fire and the winter. With its long dark hours and its enforced proximity, was the season in which these activities most intense. The evolutionary origins of human language and symbolic are subjects of continuing debate among scholars. But there is broad agreement that the social context of the evening fire, the gathering of the group in a warm, relatively safe space, with available for extended interaction, was a crucial selective environment for the release of human communicative, cognitive capacities. The anthropologist Polly Wessner, who conducted a detailed study of the evening fires of the Kalahans, Onsi-san of the Kalahari, comparing the content of daytime and nighttime social interaction, she found that while daytime conforms to the biological economic complaints criticism, nighttime fire conversations were dominating singing, and distant people. This shift in conversational mode, meaning fired, argued, was a universal human behavior with deep evolutionary roots. Storytelling in particular would have one of the most important activities of the winter night. In a world without writing, oral narrative was the mechanism by which practical knowledge, where game could be found, how to navigate to water source, how to treat a particular kind of wound, how to build a particular kind of shelter, was transmitted between generations. The winter camp, with its enforced inactivity and its long dark hours, provided aid conditions for the extended transmission of this knowledge. Children who spent the active months spring, summer learning by doing would spend the listening to the stories and explanations of the elders, deepening and contextualizing the practical knowledge they had accumulated. The psychology of darkness, fear, dream, and the spirit world, the darkness, the sea. Winter night was not merely a physical condition. It was a psychological one. For a species that is fundamentally visual, dependent on light for navigation, and threat detection, the long hours of winter darkness created a distinctive psychological environment in which the boundaries between the real and the imagined were measurable than in the bright light of day. Shadows at the edge of the firelight could be spirits. Strange sounds in the dark could be interpreted as phenomena or as the vivid dreams that characterize the early hours of sleep. At a period of activity could be experienced as it's from ancestors, as Esther, or as visions with prophetic significance. The study of the archaeological evidence for empirical spiritual among early humans suggests that the winter season was particularly as ritual activity. The cave art of the European Upper Paleolithic, the extraordinary paintings at Lascaux, Altamira, Chauvet, Doven, and dozens of other sites was almost certainly created and viewed firelight in the deep darkness of underground spaces that replicated and amplified the psychological conditions. The winter. The animals depicted: mammoth, horse, rhinoceros, cave lion, are the prey and the predators of the mammoth steppe. and representation in their connotation in the context underground darkness suggests again with spiritual engagement the spiritual dimensions of the hunt that was at least partly associated with the winter season, when hunting activity was most intense. The stakes of success, failure were highest. Shamanic practice, the use altered states with spirituals and entities, and power or knowledge for the benefit of the community is one of the most widespread features of hunter-gatherer spiritual life across the world and also in the world. And archaeological traces appear in the Upper Paleolithic, the winter camp with its long nights, its firelight that could and its enforced social intimacy. Practice. The relationship between altered states, consciousness, the winter night, and the spiritual life of the group was not incidental. It was central. It was to the way in which early human communities made meaning of their world and maintained the psychological coherence necessary for effective collective action. Chapter 9. Surviving the coldest nights. The keys. When everything even go wrong, and shelter and the fire and warm clothing and a full stomach. There were nights in the Pleistocene. When the cold was simply overwhelming. Nights when a storm brought temperatures far below what the shelter could adequately resist. When the fire went out, could not immediately be lit. When illness or injury compromised the thermoregulatory capacity of one or more group members. When food supplies ran low and low caloric resources for maintaining body temperature were depleted. On these, survival was not guaranteed, and the archaeological record preserves evidence of the costs when it failed. The bones of individuals who died in winter, the trauma patterns that suggest cold-related illness and injury, the demographic patterns that show elevated mortality in the winter and early spring months. Hypothermia. Below the level normal physiological function can be maintained is one of the most insidious dangers of cold weather survival. It is insidious because its early stages, characterized by uncontrollable shivering, coordination, and confusion, can be mistaken for fatigue or illness. And because its later stages paradoxically produce a sensation of warmth, that false comfort that can cause the victim to remove clothing and take other behaviors The management of a hypothermic group member. A challenge that required knowledge of the conditions and symptoms, progression, and the ability to provide effective rewarming, which, without modern medical equipment, meant primarily the application of body heat from other group members, the warming fluids, and the restoration of a fire, frostbite, the freezing of peripheral tissues, particular ears, and nose, was almost certainly a common occupational hazard of winter life in Pleistocene cold climates. Archaeological evidence for frostbite in ancient population is that late, but that not absent. Bone changes associated with repeated and thawing injuries have been identified in skeletal remains from prehistoric populations. The management of frostbite required warming the affected tissues. A sad process, if correctly, could cause more damage than the original freezing, and the protection of damage from damage exposure and infection. Traditional knowledge of frostbite management in Arctic peoples with long experience of cold weather suggests sophisticated understanding and this condition already certainly through experience. The annual rhythm, winter's end of meaning of spring experience it in a Pleistocene hunter-gatherer community, not merely a matter of enduring cold nights. It was the full seasonal transformation of the landscape. Supply groups, the psychological horizon of its members. Winter was a constrainant dependence on stored food, on the hunting of large game in difficult conditions, the warmth of fire, and the closeness of the group. It was also a time of heightened intensity, of origin talent, of ritual, of the forging of the bonds that would sustain an ED. The challenges of the year ahead, the arrival of spring, then the lengthening of days, the warming of temperatures, the appearance of the first new vegetation, and the return of migratory animals must have been one of the most psychologically significant events of the annual cycle. It represented the lifting of the constraints that winter imposed. The freedom to move more widely across the landscape among historical hunter-gatherer communities. The transition, the trickling, typically marked by some of the most significant ritual activities of the year. of the year, ceremonies that ceremonies the ritual of triumph and the survival of the community through another winter. There is every reason to believe similar rituals this transition in Pleistocene communities. Use. Survival through the winter was genuinely uncertain in a way above both humans and comfortable homes is not. Book Chapter 10. The legacy in our bodies and our minds. What the pointers last in tens of thousands of generations that our ancestors spent survived and slavidas, having hold Pleistocene bark left their body and my mind in ways that modern research is only to fully appreciate. The physiological adaptations to cold that evolved during this period. The specific patterns of fat distribution that provide insulation while preserving mobility. The thermoregulatory responses that conserve total temperature in cold environments. The metabolic flexibility that allows the body to shift between burning carbohydrate, fat as fuel, depending on availability. Are features of the human body in response to the false challenges of winter survival on the Pleistocene steppe. The sleep patterns documented Jerome Siegel and their researchers in traditional hunter-gatherer communities. The polycyclic, fire-tending sleep cycles. The seasonal variation in sleep duration, the tendency in individuals within a group to maintain offset sleep schedules are probably direct inheritances from the survival of the Pleistocene winter camp. Modern sleep science is increasingly the standard recommendation of 8 hours of consolidated nightly sleep may be a recent cultural artifact imposed by the artificial light and the scheduled work patterns of industrial society. Our species' ancient sleep biology. Even some aspects of our psychological relationship, darkness and cold, may carry echoes of the Pleistocene winter. The tendency of many people to experience lower mood during the winter months. A phenomenon severe enough in some individuals to be classified as seasonal affective disorder. May reflect an evolved psychological the constraints, dangers of winter that was once adaptive, the comfort that most people feel in the presence of a fire, the particular quality that develops in a warm enclosed on a cold night, the heightened intimacy of conversation by firelight, These are not merely aesthetic preferences, but may be deeply rooted responses to the environment in which human psychology shaped the extraordinary resilience of our species. The story of how early humans slept through snowy winter nights in tents is ultimately a story out one of the most remarkable features of our species. Our ability to survive in environments that are fundamentally hostile to unprotected human biology through the application of cultural technology, fire, clothing, shelter, food storage, social cooperation, rather than through anatomical specialization. Unlike the polar bear, where with its thick fur and specialized metabolism, or the Arctic fox with a dense coat and cold adapted physiology, the human body has not as nanodramati, specializations of cold. We are, by the standards of the cold climates we inhabited, remarkably fragile physical creatures. What we have instead of physical adaptations is and social flexibility, the ability to learn, to innovate, transmit knowledge across generations, and approaches. The campfire at the center of the winter shelter is of the most symbols of what makes us human. Around it, gathered not warmth but for everything that makes human life distinctively human. Language and storytelling, music and ritual. The teaching of the young and the honoring of the old, the negotiation of relationships and the maintenance, the mésayences, the facing of fear, and the celebration of survival. The cold outside was real and deadly, was genuinely the difference between life and death. But the warmth of the fire was all something else. A symbol of the collective human project. The ongoing effort facing with fratres, and combines to make a home in a world that not make that easy. We are the descendants of the people kept that fire burning. Every person alive today carries this DNA connected of ancestors who successfully navigated thousands of Pleistocene winters, who built shelters from mammoth bones and reindeer hides, kept fires burning through temperatures of -40, who made clothes so effective that they could move through blizzards of prey, who stored that body heat, who told stories around the fire, kept the knowledge. We are, in the most literal biological sense, Yeah, since the children of winter survivors. The cold made us. Understanding how our ancestors faced this to understand something essential about what we are, and where we came from. In the epilogue, a night that never ends. The fires still burns somewhere in the high latitudes of the world tonight. A person is lying in a tent on frozen ground, listening to the wind against the fabric walls, watching the glow of a small stove in the darkness. They may be a scientific researcher in Antarctica, a wilderness announcer, a reindeer on the Siberian tundra. The specific details of technology, synthetic fabrics, titanium stove parts, GPS navigation, different from those of a Pleistocene hunter on the mammoth steppe, but the fundamental experience is the same. Though pressing in from outside, the warmth inside, by fabric and fire, and the heat of a body, the darkness, the stars overhead, the consciousness of one's own smallness and the warmth's preciousness. The 50,000 generations, that's from the first humans, who sheltered a winter night, a very long time, and an evolutionary history. A very short one. The brain that figures out how to warmer is not significant from the brain that figured it out then. The ingenuity, the resourcefulness, the determination to survive are not modern achievements. They are oldest achievements of our lineage, shaped by pressures so ancient, so continuous that they are now as much a part of us as our heartbeat. The next time you lie in a warm bed on a cold night, listening to the wind outside, and feeling the comfort of the warmth around you, spare a thought for the ancestors who made that warmth possible. Not the ancestors who invented central heating or synthetic insulation, but the ones who were there first, in the dark and the cold, with nothing but their intelligence and their fair fire and each other. They slept. They survived. And we are here. They did.